I'm Sally Feston. This is my Darling Derry, my 5th poem collection. It's about my father, Derek Richter, who founded the Mental Health Foundation 70 years ago. It's based on letters and diaries, so my Darling Derry are actually his mother's words. I've brought it out in 2019, which is the Mental Health Foundation's anniversary year. Moths, ghosts. My house is full of them. I live with waves of silence, but their lives roar enormous through my rooms, hung on walls, stuffed in bookcases, leaking from wounded suitcases tied with string. It rained last night, and the dead fell down with the drops. To gather where the land is flat and wind-blown, the quiet stores their smiles. I press my finger where theirs have been, thread words to tumble them back, all talking, arguing. The moths and the ghosts, of course, are my father's family, present in our house in the form of paintings and books and sculptures and furniture that they made. What do I know about my father's family? There was always a secrecy about his brother and sister, here, his sister, and his brother. I didn't learn until quite late that they both became schizophrenic, that in fact during my youth they were both in mental hospitals. But when I had this huge archive of letters and diaries and reports from hospitals, I seemed to see it in as a whole. The other thing I learned was that human problems don't just start. They have a before and a before, and that's why my book covers 2 generations. My paternal grandmother has been married for 16 years. She is very unhappy. She was an unusual woman, Frances, and she married a workaholic. And he's nearly always away from home. He's got a huge business making building furniture, and she's left on her own. Their 2 children are at school, and there's my father, who's left at home. I'm going to read a poem now about my father being at home. He's about 8 years old, and some words from it are actually taken from his diary. Derek's play. Like an echo, he's at home long after the others. The last child, alone with his mother. Charcoal, potassium nitrate, sulfur. Derek Richter, firework display. January the 4th, after tea on Saturday. All my own fireworks. I'm going to read you something about Ernie, who's his sister, who's 5 years older. And she lives on poetry and art. She's very sensitive, doesn't have a very strong opinion about herself. And her mother is always worried about her, especially when she's at school. A message from Frances to her daughter, Ernie, 1916. My darling little girl, are you better and getting to lessons? I hope to come and see you, but have been unwell. Derry and I gathered a huge bunch of orchids and cowslips from the field. We spotted a weasel by the hedge, and nesting birds in the front garden can nearly fly. You'll see that unwell is a word that's repeated both by Frances about herself and about Ernie. She ends, my love to you, dear child. I think of you very often and want my little girl to grow strong and well. Your loving mother. Ernie has grown. She's now in her 20s, and her mother is away in Wiesbaden because she always feels unwell at home. She just needs to get away. The next poem I'm going to read was the sort of highlight of Ernie's life. She's 21, and because she's been feeling unwell so often, her father sends her on a painting course with Leonard Richmond. You can look him up on Wikipedia. He was quite a well-known tutor and quite a well-known artist in the 30s. And she fell in love with her tutor when they were in France, and he asked her to go away with him. And she did. Ernie's tutor. "Your painting is better than mine," he said. And his words reached out and felt like love. He believed in her strength, where it might lead, and his words make music, and music moves. His words reached out and felt like love. "Come to Paris with me," he said. His words make music, and music moves, so they shared a bed. "Come to Paris with me," he said. If a voice hadn't hissed adultery, they'd have stayed together, shared a bed. But afterwards, she could only cry. If a voice hadn't whispered adultery, she'd believe in her strength and where it led. But after, she could only cry. "Your painting is better than mine," he said. He had a very sad end, that trip, that painting trip, with her tutor, because his wife, from whom he was estranged, discovered he'd been away with Ernie and wrote to her father, who came down on the poor girl like a ton of bricks. And it was too much for Ernie to stand his caution, his words, and she went down to St. Ives, where she'd been with Leonard Richmond, and she jumped off a high cliff, and she was hauled out of the sea, and she developed a psychosis, a schizophrenic psychosis, from which she never recovered for the rest of her life. My father did, of course, start the Mental Health Foundation, which was probably the best thing he ever did, and the only thing he could have done in the case. How did my father react to the fact that not only his sister was in a mental home, but his brother was becoming schizophrenic too? He was actually still at school when his sister was schizophrenic. By the time his brother turned, he had a family of 3 young children. This poem gives an idea of what he did. What Wikipedia doesn't say about my father: that these were the days of lobotomy, ECT, injections with testosterone, thyroid, and Prolan, though nothing necessarily helped. That his sister was screaming God knows what, throwing her voices about the house, so he covered his ears. Years later, when he sang in the car, and it was a tune she played on the piano, the notes swept through him like ink in water. That it wasn't long before his brother went crazy too. My father didn't curl up, he burgeoned, had to solve the riddle, and it jerked him this way, that way. Such a wind. When he arrived at my bedside in his bike clips, I could hear his galactic heartbeat. That he fell in love with his garden, dug long into summer evenings, had a passion for sowing things. Sugar snaps, runner beans, roses, pansies. Pick them and they come again. Sweating, showering soil, he invoked the rubaiyat. And look, 1,000 blossoms with the day woke, and 1,000 scattered into clay.